Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Eternal Nightmare. In a small town south of Los Angeles, where everyone knew each other, strange events began to unfold. Rumors spread among the residents about strange dreams that haunted them at night. At first, it seemed like mere coincidence, but with each new case, the horrors became more real. Elisabeth, a young woman, worked as a librarian at the local library. She had always considered herself a practical person, not prone to panic or superstition. But what began with her nightmares made her question reality. At first, it all seemed like an ordinary dream. She was simply standing in a dark corridor, surrounded by thick fog. The feeling of fear was real, even when she woke up in a cold sweat. But each time, the dream took on new forms. She began to hear strange whispers, and then, the rustling of someone behind her. And when she tried to turn around, no one was there. One time, after waking from yet another nightmare, she noticed something strange. There was something like a scratch on her arm, but she couldn't remember when she could have cut herself. A few days later, the scratch became more pronounced, and bruises appeared on her skin, as if from physical contact. What was it? The fear from the new and constant night visions led her to see a psychotherapist. The psychotherapist was an old family friend and leaned toward the idea that these nightmares were the result of stress and emotional trauma. But Elisabeth wasn't sure if everything could be explained by just psychological factors. She knew that something sinister had started to invade her reality. Meanwhile, another unexplained event occurred in the town. An inexplicable attack on the local school. Teenagers began to talk about a strange man who visited them in their dreams. He resembled a monster, with a face made up of red scars, black, empty eye sockets, and sleeves covered in fiery burns, as if he were part of the fire himself. But the most terrifying thing was that he was able to attack in dreams, and nothing could stop him. This was just the beginning. As Elisabeth and her friends later discovered, all these events were somehow linked to the history of an old psychiatric institution that stood on the edge of the town many years ago, before it was shut down due to numerous cases of mysterious deaths and mental disorders. According to legends, it was there that people who were difficult to treat by other methods were once treated. But all these attempts caused the patients not only to suffer from mental disorders but also to literally die from the horrors they saw in their dreams. Perhaps what happened in the town wasn't a coincidence. Perhaps this nightmare had awoken after all these years of being forgotten. Elisabeth sat on the shattered old couch in the psychotherapist's office, trying to make sense of what was happening. Dr. Martinson, known for his calm voice and deep knowledge of psychiatry, listened attentively to her story but seemed unable to find answers to her questions. Each of her nightmares became more and more real, and the feeling of fear that overwhelmed her during sleep was so intense that she woke up with a sensation of physical pain. Elisabeth, I want you to try to calm down and think about when these nightmares began. What happened in your life before that? Asked Martinson. She sat in silence, recalling every detail. These dreams had started a few weeks ago, after she had visited the old psychiatric institution on the outskirts of town, which was now closed. She had been curious about the history of the place, and at the time, she hadn't suspected that it could mark the beginning of her own nightmare. Now, considering what had been happening, she was starting to suspect that this story might not just be a fabrication. Moreover, that night when she had been at the institution, everything seemed off. She could feel an invisible force hanging around her, as though someone was watching her closely. The place felt alive, as if the shadow of the past had never truly left, leaving behind something dark and ominous. And now, these dreams wouldn't let her rest. They had become so terrifying that she could no longer tell where the dream ended and reality began. After several sessions with the psychotherapist, she realized that her dreams weren't just filled with fear but also with a figure that became more and more realistic. She had seen it, that figure with a face that couldn't be described as human, with burning eye sockets and horrific wounds, as if it were a creation of hell itself. Elisabeth decided to learn more about the history of the psychiatric institution. She found a few old newspaper articles that mentioned the place. As it turned out, there had indeed been numerous terrifying incidents there, and one article spoke of mysterious deaths of patients. The worst part was that these fatal cases were always linked to sleep. Patients had died after reporting nightmares that haunted them. Over time, all these people disappeared, and the psychiatric institution was closed without any explanation. Now, when the town had long forgotten about the institution, unexplained events began once again. One woman who lived nearby admitted that she had heard from her late grandfather about a terrifying creature that came to people in their dreams at night. She told them it was the spirit of the very doctor who had once conducted horrific experiments on patients at the institution, trying to summon nightmares in order to find a way to control the human mind. Elisabeth decided to return there. She began preparing for what she might find, knowing that she would have to face the creature that had caused terror in her dreams. That evening, when she found herself near the old psychiatric institution once again, the moon was especially bright, as if lighting the path she was about to take. The doors were locked, but the feeling that this place was still alive never left her. She cautiously approached the entrance and noticed that one of the doors was slightly ajar. This surprised her, as no one had permission to enter. She stepped inside, feeling the cold breath of darkness that filled the space. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and the walls, almost alive, seemed to absorb the sound of her steps. And then she saw it, the very thing she had feared. On the wall was a crack that looked like a huge wound. And at that moment, she felt a cold touch on her skin, as if someone was touching her from behind. Suddenly, from the same dark corridor, he appeared again. The same man with a face that could not be called human, with burning eye sockets. "I know why you're here," he whispered. Elisabeth felt her heart race, and the air became thick, as if she were surrounded by mist. She took a step back, but fear froze her movements. The man with the burning eye sockets was getting closer, and with every step he took, it felt as though he was treading on her soul, not just the floor. "You can't escape from what you've seen," his voice was soft, but deep like an echo in the void. "You came here for the truth, but truth is not always what it seems." Elisabeth couldn't utter a word, but fear overwhelmed her more and more. She didn't understand why this nightmare haunted her, and why she was connected to this place, to this creature. She took a few more steps back, but suddenly her feet tripped over an old log lying on the floor, and she fell. But even falling didn't disturb the ominous calm. "You're not here by accident," the man continued. "My dreams have become yours. My nightmares have become yours. And now we are one. We always have been." Elisabeth lifted her head. She couldn't explain how it happened, but the dark corridor she had been walking down began to change. The walls started trembling, and all the doors that had once been locked now opened, releasing clouds of black smoke. This wasn't just a place. It was a labyrinth of darkness, a place where dreams and reality collided, and those who entered couldn't find their way back. She rose to her feet, determined to find a way out, but the shadow of the creature was closing in. Every step, every movement in the dark seemed to tear her apart, and the feeling of hopelessness grew stronger. Fear gripped her chest, and her mind started losing its connection to reality. And then another turn appeared before her. She knew she couldn't go back, but moving forward felt equally dangerous. She still couldn't understand how her dreams were connected to this place. What force was hidden here, and why had it chosen her as its victim? As it turned out, the nightmares weren't random. They were the result of the tyranny of psychiatric experiments conducted on people in this institution. Every patient treated here underwent attempts to manipulate their dreams as a path to mental control. Some patients died after their consciousness fell under the power of this sinister monster. But the scariest part was that these experiments hadn't ended with the closure of the institution. The man with the burning eye sockets wasn't just a monster, but the result of a failed attempt to control people through their dreams. He had been fabricated, yet at the same time, he was real. All those who had died hadn't found peace. They became part of this nightmare, and now Elisabeth was starting to feel it too. Every thought, every decision she made took on a new dimension as she realized that she wasn't just walking through physical space. She was walking through the deep pathways of her mind, where every fear came to life and became real. But she knew she had to move forward. She couldn't allow herself to stop, because doing so would mean that the nightmare would become her life. Suddenly, a large round hall appeared before her, with mirrors hanging on the walls. They reflected not only her but everything happening in her mind. Moments from her life, moments from the past, unresolved things, all her doubts, all the fears that had brought her here. She approached one of the mirrors and saw her reflection. But it wasn't as she was used to seeing it. She looked old, exhausted, as if decades of suffering had marked her face. But she knew it was just another illusion, another nightmare. "You can't defeat me," she heard a voice emanating from the depths of the mirror. Elisabeth screamed and stepped back. But something in her heart broke. She realized that if she wanted to escape, she would have to do more than fight the monster. She would have to overcome herself, her fears, her past traumas. And so, she made a decision. Not to run. She had to take her strength back. Only then could she defeat this place. Elisabeth stood before the mirror reflecting her horrors, and every step toward it felt like a battle with her own soul. She had already realized that she couldn't simply run from her nightmares, couldn't let them take her. She had to change the rules of the game. But how? How could she defeat something that lived in her dreams and awakened in her reality? Suddenly, in the darkness of the corridor, the familiar voice echoed again, the cold and ominous whisper that sounded like the groan of 1,000 souls that had once lived in this place. You can't win, Elisabeth. All your fears have gathered here, and you are part of them, it said, and she felt its words piercing her soul. She closed her eyes, trying not to listen, trying not to succumb. She was no longer the same as before. She was no longer the girl who feared her dreams. She understood that her fears were not just illusions. They were everything she feared in real life, all her unresolved questions, doubts and pain. And all of it had come to life. She took another step toward the mirror, and a determined expression appeared on her face. She wouldn't let him take her. She wouldn't let this creature control her any longer. She reached out to the mirror and struck its surface with force. But to her surprise, the mirror didn't shatter. It just began to crack, releasing black threads that coiled around her body, as if trying to consume her. But Elisabeth knew, if she could overcome these fears, if she could tear apart these threads, she would be free. She gathered all her strength and began to fight. At first, it was difficult. The shadows and monsters emerging from every crack, from every reflection, tried to seize her again. But she was ready. She didn't let them affect her, pushing away every attack, refusing to let them control her. She felt her will growing stronger, and the threads of darkness gradually began to weaken. I am no longer afraid, she cried, and her voice shattered the silence like thunder in the endless night. The mirror, once a ruthless battlefield, now began to glow, like a candle being extinguished under the weight of her power. And in that moment, as the shadows began to dissipate, the man with the burning eye sockets disappeared. He was no longer part of her fears. He no longer had power. And suddenly, she felt all the eerie images that had emerged around her crumble into pieces, like mist dispersing in the sunlight. She stepped out of the labyrinth of darkness and saw the exit before her once again. She was free. But not entirely. She knew that this nightmare could return, but now she had a different perspective on everything. She was no longer that same fear-stricken person. She was stronger. Elisabeth woke up in her bed. A dream? Or was it reality? She felt exhausted, but the sense of freedom that enveloped her was incredible. She no longer had that terror before sleep, no longer feared the dark. Everything had changed. Although the dreams were no longer as frightening, she knew that this place, the institution where it all began, still existed. And she would have to return to close this chapter for good, and perhaps help those who were still trapped in their own nightmares. But first, she felt the need to do one more thing. Share this story. Because as long as there are those who don't understand how easily they can find themselves in this nightmare, which is no longer just a dream but a real reality, it's important to tell it. And she knew this for sure. Nothing will disappear until we defeat our own fears. Elisabeth woke up, but the feeling that the nightmare was not over still lingered. She sat in her bed, feeling every part of her body tremble from what had happened. All those dreams, all those horrific images, they hadn't left her. And even though she had destroyed the darkness in that labyrinth, something remained. She looked around her room, everything seemed normal, but there was a strange smell in the air. Not just the smell of sleep, but of something rotting, old. Suddenly, the world before her eyes dimmed, and that reflection reappeared. The man with the burning eye sockets was once again standing before her, now in the center of her room. He wasn't appearing from the mirror. He wasn't emerging from the darkness. He stood right in front of her, just like in her nightmares, and now she understood that this wasn't just an image. He was real. You thought you could escape me? His voice was low, hollow, and his eyes flickered again like a fire that would never extinguish. Elisabeth wiped the sweat from her forehead, but her movements felt heavy. She was lost. What was happening? She was sure she had overcome her fears, that she had escaped this nightmare. How could this be happening? You don't understand, he stepped closer. His face was ruined and distorted, as if by some unknown force, but every contour and every wrinkle was familiar. It was part of her horror. And he had never left. You've been mine all this time. Your nightmares were mine. You couldn't break free. You're not just my creation. You were, and always will be, part of this. Elisabeth, trying not to break, tried to hide under the blanket, but she felt herself becoming part of this nightmare. The man reached out, and her body was overwhelmed by cold. She felt her soul gradually dissolving, turning into something that had long since lost its humanity. Suddenly, everything around her started to change. From the walls, the floor, and even from her own skin, dark figures began to appear. Shadows with the faces of all those she had once loved and lost. And now they were part of this reality. They were bound to this place, to this institution, just like her. It seemed as though she had entered an endless tunnel, where there was no end, where every step echoed with suffering. She realized she hadn't just returned in her body. She had entered a place where all nightmares live, where time doesn't matter, and every nightmare is an endless, cruel reality. You've long been part of this place, the voice of the man echoed, and it no longer sounded ominous. It sounded as though she had become part of him, and this creature was now part of her. They had merged into a single shadow. The shadows surrounding her began to move, drawing closer as if she were their final victim. All the imaginary walls she had built began to crumble into pieces, leaving nothing but a dark abyss. She could no longer distinguish where her thoughts ended and where his power began. She had become part of his nightmare, and now he controlled every move she made. And then, when she could no longer perceive reality, when her consciousness had been consumed, she heard his final words, which sounded like a verdict. You will dream of me forever. The world around her faded away. And even when she woke up, even when she tried to open her eyes again and again, she found herself in the same place, in front of the same mirror. She realized she could no longer escape this. It wasn't just a dream. It was her reality. Her shadows had become her destiny. And now, no matter where she was, this place, this man, this nightmare would never leave her. And this nightmare would continue. Forever. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.